Could I have a piece of paper? Okay, today we're dealing with India, and I said last class that the West regarded India as very exotic, very different, and I think um, in deep ways it is. Um, it has an enormously long history, and a religion plays absolutely central role, which of course is true of all the civilizations we've looked at, the Aztecs and so on. The Incas, they had their religiosity and so on, and it was it's always an established church of one kind, temple religion, which is closely associated with the state. We've seen that in all of the cases that we've dealt with, including the Europeans, until really the French Revolution. It was the case. But I would say, in the case of India, religion is very personal, deeply rooted, and closely related. It led to the development of the caste system, and I'll have more to say about that as we go along. And the caste system had a huge impact on India, and still does. Especially, we have seen that despite the efforts of the Indian government since 1947 to uh, uh, abolish caste, in the last decades, uh, given the overall tide of conservative neoliberalism in the world, India has come to be dominated by a right-wing nationalist government. Economic development continues, but from the point of view of culture and politics, the regime is extremely conservative, and they promote this kind of nationalistic Hinduism. You'll understand what this is in a little while. And the caste system, which had been kind of fading and so on, it's not explicit, but it plays a really big role socially in India. And if you are on the top, if you come from the Brahmins, who are the top people in society, descendants of the priests, um, there is a connection, but it's not one to one between the shade of your skin, the whiteness you have, and being a Brahmin. Um, you're good. But if you come from the darker population in India and you come from the untouchable class, the lowest class, the lowest caste in Indian society, it's held against you. It's you and your family suffer. So this is part of the scene. Moreover, we have the fact that really since the 10th, 11th century, the Muslim invaders took over what was still a Hindu country, came to dominate, and the what happened was the ethnic divide, which is based on religion. Um, uh, from that point onwards, from the 11th century, it played a huge role. Not that it was determined always, but there were periods, as you will see, when tensions between Muslims and Hindus became severe, and we're seeing today that, given the nature of the Hindu nationalist character of the regime, um, these tensions are real in India, and so these are two facts in terms of sort of understanding. Because I am going to give you the historical background, which is complex, involved, and so on, but uh, it it's important now, so you have to have some sort of a sense of this. So let's start. And first of all, what I'm going to do is basically give you a very brief chronological ordering of the history so that you have an overall grasp. Well, as I said, um, uh, Indian civilization is very old, and it starts in 2600 BC, about 500 or maybe 1,000 years after it starts in Mesopotamia, in Iraq. Um, 2600 BC is about the time that Chinese civilization gets going. So that's where it's located. And we can call that's the start of it. Um, in this period, from 2600 um, down to around 1200 AD, that's nearly 3,000 years. We would consider this the Hindu period in Indian history. From 2600 BC to around 1200 AD is the Hindu period. And then around 1200, we can say that the Muslims, they invaded earlier. We can say they consolidated their rule around 1200, and they ruled India, especially the northern part. The south remained independent, but the north 2/3 of India, from 1200 until 1756, 1200 to 1756, the Muslim period of rule. And then comes the period of British rule. The British or the English, uh, they they got control of India in 1756, and their control lasted until 1947. So 1756, 1947. And finally, the last period, independence, 1947, the British were forced out, and India, or sort of the Indian subcontinent, became independent, but not as a unified state, because in that year, 1947, India split apart. Um, the the northwest and the northeast became Pakistan, and the rest became India. And then subsequently, I believe the year was 1971, Pakistan split apart. The western part became Pakistan, or was Pakistan, and the eastern part became Bangladesh. So you have three states on the Indian subcontinent. But we're treating the subcontinent as one entity. Indian civilization with all its complexities and the mixing of Muslims and Hindus. So that's the general outline. So we start our account with the earliest phase. We're marching through and sort of getting the level. Indian civilization is sediment after sediment of history. There's this long history, and so you have to have some sense of that. And the first stage, by the way, all of this is in key words. You carefully did the chronology in key words, and all of the concepts that I'm talking about are in key words. Well, the first stage is the Indus Valley civilization, 2600 BC until 1700 BC. We have archaeological remains. There was a writing, but for the most part, it's undeciphered. The writing isn't fully understood. So we don't have a really deep sort of understanding of this Indus Valley civilization. By the way, I want to say, it is remarkable on a worldwide basis, the combination of archaeology, history. It is remarkable how much we know about world history. There's incredible development. I would say that European history is very well known. The history of the Americas is very, very well known. I would say that Chinese history is really well known. India, we need to know more about India. We need to know more about the Ottoman Empire. I would say what I gave you about the Ottoman Empire, there is some history, but we need more research on the Ottoman Empire. In any case, in terms of this Indus Valley civilization, and what this is that there is this in the northwest part of India, where mostly Pakistan now, there is a river called the Indus River, which runs into the Indian Ocean, the Indus River, and that's where this civilization developed. So that's why it's called the Indus Valley or River civilization. So we know some of the words. Some of the words are carried over into later phases of Indian civilization. We know that these people, like the people in India or China, they used plows. Agriculture was developed, but this area was quite arid, and so the state that did exist, one of the things it did was to build a lot of hydraulic and irrigation systems to water the fields, as the state played a considerable role in terms of distributing water so that it could support a population. There were towns. And in terms of metallurgy, it was a Bronze Age civilization, just like the the Incas and the Aztecs. And in terms of the social hierarchy, we know that the top people, there were kings and there were priests. There was a temple religion. The temple religion is closely associated with the state, as I've explained. This is, and as I said, we have some of the words we have passed down into later Indian languages, and we know that one of the gods that these people worship was a god by the name of Shiva, who is the central god in Hinduism. So the god Shiva, who's this very interesting kind of a guy, Shiva, this god, this dancing god, he plays a role even in the Indus Valley civilization. Now, all of this changes. That's the first stage. And we have the next phase is called the Aryan phase, because it is said that from the north, from Central Asia, it's always Central Asia, came invaders using horses, the so-called Aryans. So this phase, 1700 to 1000, is known as the Aryan phase of civilization. And these people were pastoralists. They had horses and cattle. They had wheeled vehicles. They invaded and took over India, and they enslaved significant elements of the population, were made slaves under these Aryans. And they collected tribute from the subject populations. It's typical, you've seen this before. But here we get really, in terms of the development of Hinduism, the first thing we see is that they had priests of some sort, and they spoke, and ultimately they wrote a language which is called Sanskrit, the Sanskrit, which became the priestly language of Hinduism. So the priestly language appeared. And they did produce clearly a religious literature. This was in a sort of it was an oral literature. People memorized long poems and long passages, especially the priests and so on. And then ultimately this came to be written down, and this is called, and it's in key words, the Vedic literature, religious literature. It's named after the first main section of this religious literature, which is called the Veda, Veda. Again, in key words, you find the Veda. And so we call this whole literature the Vedic literature. It's almost entirely religious, and there are prayers, there are hymns, there are all sorts of theological and metaphysical speculations about the nature of the relationship between humanity and the gods, and so on. This is the kind of literature. So it was at first an oral literature, and ultimately it was written down in Sanskrit. The ordinary people could not read this language. This became the foundation for, that is to say, this Sanskrit language, and the Vedic literature became the foundation of Hinduism. Now, I want to say something about the Aryan myth, the Aryan myth. And what this is about, it's in two parts, I would say. The first part is that the first scholars to seriously study Indian civilization, I'm meaning what you could call a truly scholarly, or we can say scientific way, were British and German scholars in the 19th century. They were the first people who really investigated and began to sort of piece out what all of this meant and begin to sort of develop a historical account of what Indian civilization. And these people had their own prejudices. They in the 19th century, the British, the Germans, some of them at least, not all, but some of them, they had this idea. Well, the Aryans were the conquerors, the Aryans, and they were. This is the heyday of colonialism. Remember, British colonialism. The Aryans seemed to be the dominant class. They lorded it over the rest of the population. They were white like Europeans, and so uh, uh, numbers of writers, some of them kind of scholars, began to invent a kind of myth in which they said that these Aryans, they come from Central Asia, and their language is similar to the Indo-European languages. This is true. There is an affinity between Sanskrit and the languages that ultimately developed in Europe. But they went further than that, and they said, well, the Aryans were this super race, white race, and they dominate India. Look at us, we're Germanic, and we're Aryans. The English took this up as well. And they invented this idea of the Aryans. And of course, this is significant because ultimately, I would say in India, but especially in Europe, it kind of developed into a kind of Aryan myth, which took the form ultimately of fascism. This is the background. This is part of the historical background to the emergence of fascism, particularly in Germany, but also you find it in England and a little bit in France. But it was dangerous, and of course, in the 20th century, it was deadly. That's part of the Aryan myth, but lately this has been sort of the question of myth has come up, and there are certain Indian scholars, very very smart people, very sophisticated people, who are questioning the whole. I gave you this account of the history of the Aryans in India. Some people are saying now, I'm reporting what the scholarship is saying. Some of these scholars are saying, listen, this idea of the Aryan invasion and of their conquest and superiority. What are the actual proofs that you have? What is the evidence of this? And some of these scholars are questioning this whole idea that somehow these invaders came in and so on. That they claim it's a lot more complicated. The problem really is that there is a kind of shortage of source material. We don't have enough evidence to create a seriously reliable narrative about this early period. I'm sure that later on, as things develop, we probably will get such a narrative. So that's the Aryan period. The next period we talk about, that is to say, we can call we have the Indus Valley civilization, we have the Aryan civilization, and now we have what we can call the civilization of the Ganges plain. I've mentioned that the Indus River that runs into the um, the Indian Ocean. But there's another big river in India, up in the northeastern part of India, which rises in the Himalayas, and that is the Ganges. Ganges, key words. It rises from the snows of the Himalayas and it flows into the Bay of Bengal. And this period, at the beginning, let us say around 1000, the Ganges river ran into the Bay of Bengal, but the whole area was covered with forests, thick forests, jungles. And what happened between 1000 and 500 was the clearing of the jungle, the clearing of the forests by settlers, by peasants who came into this area and developed a very intense agriculture. And they were able to do this because they had iron tools. This is the 1000. You see the same thing in the Near East, about 1000. The Iron Age. Forget the Bronze Age, we're now in the Iron Age. And they clear and pioneer agriculture in the Ganges plain, and this becomes the site of a very rich, intensive agriculture between 1000 and 500. And as a result of that, I mean, there are these peasants. So you have a class of dominant landlords, and you have little kingdoms or kinglets emerging, rulers, small, over relatively limited territories. The leaders of the various tribes or clans, the families that developed, these clan leaders, these tribal leaders became little kings in the course of this Ganges period from 1000 to 500. And here we get the next step in the development of Hinduism, because we've seen Sanskrit has emerged. We've seen that the Vedic or the Veda has emerged, which is key, the text, language, text. And now we see a definite social structure beginning to emerge, beginning to crystallize. And the social structure, there are 4 hierarchical groups, that is to say, from the top to the bottom, 4 groups, and we call each group Varna. These are the Varnas, Varnas, keywords, Varnas, and lo and behold, at the top, the first Varna, the superior Varna, are the priests, who are called Brahmins, the Brahmins. And I would say to this day, these people are in control. Now, below the Brahmins, the next group are the warrior landlords. You can understand this is obvious. The priests or the Brahmins, and then the warrior landlords. Then below them are the farmer merchants, the third tier. Farmer merchants, respectable sort of types who have some land or who are in some sort of commercial business, and they are the third Varna. And then finally we get the bottom Varna, which is really important, made up of slaves, prisoners, and already the texts that are written at this time about the Varnas and so on, written by the Brahmins, because they're the literate ones. they have they can understand this language, they can read these religious texts, uh, and they speak about the lowest group as untouchable. As untouchable. These people are dirty. And so there are the four Varnas: the Brahmins, the warrior landlords, the farmer merchants, and at the bottom, the untouchables, the people who do the dirty work. The, in today's India, these are called the Dalits, Dalits. But in English, the reference is to untouchables. Now, this system is coming into being already between 1000 and 500 BC. But it takes time, just like I talked about the millets. It took time for the millets to fully mature into a system under the Ottomans, the religious self-governing groups. So this system, it began to develop already in this period from 1000 to 500, but it was not fully developed until between 600 and 1000 AD. Over 1,000 years later, it crystallized. It came into being slowly. The system, which we know as the caste system, it's first these Varnas. There is a sense of separation, but it's only beginning. It gets stronger and stronger as you go along, and by the year 1000, it's fully established as basic to Indian society. And at the top are the Brahmins, and they are the interpreters of the Hindu religious text. It's all confirmed by religion, and it's a kind of ruling class ideology, is what I would call it. What I want to just make sure that you understand. What are these castes? Well, what it means is that if you come from one of these castes or one of these Varnas, it means that you cannot intermarry outside of your Varna. There's no marriage permitted. These are hereditary groups passed on from father to son to son to son, right through the generations. You're stuck. Well, if you're a Brahmin, that's fine, I guess. But if you're a Dalit, that's it. You're at the bottom, and you will never. That's it. That's where you stay forever. So it's hereditary, and it's what we call exogenous. Again, a word in the key words, EXOGENOUS, meaning that there's no outmarriage from your caste. Hereditary and exogenous classification, which we call caste. Social mobility, I need hardly to explain, it did exist, but it was extremely difficult. It was extremely difficult to break out of this system. And it was strongest in northern India, in the plain of Ganges. Brahmanism and so on, especially strong in the northern part of India. As you go south, it does exist, but it's weaker. That's the way it would work. And there is a basic difference between North and South India. People, the upper class does tend to be a little bit whiter, and it's incredible. You know, I have looked into this. Everywhere we see in the world, whiteness is good, and people they'll talk about like in Japan or in um, other countries in Asia. If you're white, you're right, and if you're darker, no, it's not so good. What do you want to say?
Yes, I've heard there's a similar phenomenon in Ethiopia.
What's that?
There's a similar phenomenon in Ethiopia.
I'm not hear this.
Between Amhara, who are seen as more white.
What's that?
There's a similar phenomenon in Ethiopia.
Oh yes,
Yes, where
he's talking about Ethiopia, and right, it's the people, the darker people, the whiter ones rule and so on, and that's the setup. I'm trying to think of other examples. I think that throughout Asia, throughout Latin America, come to think of it, it's the same setup. Well, there in Latin America, you see, they were the conquistadores, so the whites, and so it all takes shades downward to the black, and so you have this kind of system. And I think in the modern period, it has led to there's a lot of racial tension rooted around this sort of stuff. So, okay, we're going into the next period. We've had the Indus River, we've had the Aryan, we've had the Ganges, and now we have the Age of Empires from 600 or 500 BC until 600 AD, over 1,000 years, from 500 BC to 600 AD. And this is the Age of Empires. What happens during this period is that a series of great states or empires, one after the other, they last for a while and collapses and another empire succeeds. And there is a succession of these empires between 500 BC and 600 AD. And the last and the greatest of these empires is called the Gupta Empire. And this is the period when you can say that this is a kind of a Hindu classical civilization, like Greek and Roman civilization. Similar temples, palaces, big states, administrative structures, fiscal structures, courts, a highly developed art, and the continuous stream of religious literature. Again, religion, very central. And also, I would say in this period of empires, there is more contact with the outside world. The rest of Asia, commerce develops during the Age of Empires between India and the rest of Asia. Likewise, there's contact with the West, the Middle East and the West. And in fact, one of the things that's, first of all, remind you that Alexander the great Macedonian Greek general, considered the greatest general of antiquity, he actually invaded India. Of course, he had to fall back, but he tried to invade India. And also, an interesting thing is that I came across this detail that, of course, as you'll see, it's in this period of empires that Buddhism develops in India as a kind of rival to Hinduism. And the Buddha becomes absolutely a revered figure, is a real figure. And so there are many statues of Buddha, especially in southern India. In southern India and in Sri Lanka, in the south, Buddhism entrenched itself, not in the north. Hinduism remained dominant in the north, but there was a certain entrenchment of Buddhism um, in South India. But um, archaeologists have determined that a lot of the statues of Buddha, and there are thousands of them, were mass produced in Greece. The Greeks, um, uh, particularly from the period of Alexander the Great onwards, you get serious manufacturing developing in Greece. And one of the markets becomes the production of Buddhas for India. So it shows a certain deepening of these relationships. So, age of empires, it's an age of greater contact, trade, and so on. And so it brings me to the fact that it's in this period that Buddhism emerges, actually 5th century BC, Buddhism, but it develops through the centuries, Buddhist temples and so on. And alongside it, this religion, of course, is still important in Asia. And there's also this other religion, which is quite interesting and not that well known, called Jainism. Jainism. And these two religions, what I've been saying is that this Hinduism, it's all about inequality, about the varnas and so on. So the Jainism and Buddhism is characterized by a kind of anti-caste attitude. They reject the idea that there's this fundamental inequality of the different groups, and likewise Jainism the same. And also, both of these religions reject the idea of violence. They tend to be pacifists in their religious ideas. And I would say that a central idea, again, key concept, the idea of karma, that the soul, what is karma? It's not easy to explain, but it's all about the soul. They're the soul of the individual. And the soul, the fate of the soul, is affected by the actions and the ideas that you develop. If, let's say, you're a Buddhist or a Jainist, your ideas and above all, your actions affect the fate of your soul. That is a simple definition of what karma is. This is important because they believe, especially the Buddhists, that the soul lives on after death. And so your fate in this earthly light depends on your actions. Your moral choices have an effect on the fate of your soul. And if you're good, your soul transmigrates. Their idea is transmigration of the soul. The soul leaves the body of the human, but it moves upward into other souls towards a state of ultimate bliss. If your karma is good, you move upward. But if your karma is bad, you become a worm or an ant in the next life and the life after that. And so this is the idea. I mean, religion is rife in our society. You could try that one out. I don't know. Maybe it will appeal to you. Anyway, Buddhism entrenched itself in the south of India and Sri Lanka, but also it spread became very important in China and Japan, Korea. Buddhism is an important Asian religion. Now, this age of empires, which I dated until around 600 AD, it came to an end because India was invaded a second time. The first invasion was the so-called Aryan invasion, we assume. But now a new Central Asian people, the Huns, came into India and they destroyed the Gupta Empire and these political structures. In fact, the destruction was such that not only did the empire, the Gupta Empire, disappear, but also towns, trade. There was a huge regression. It's sort of like the barbarian invasion of the Western Roman Empire. At the end of the Roman Empire, the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, towns disappear, real states disappear. A very similar thing happened in India, and we have between, we can say, 600 and 1200, the Dark Ages in India, parallels European Dark Ages, 600 to 1200. No real big states, little kinglets, whatever, very small, and no towns, no trade, no money, all of it disappeared. Terrible. But this period, the so-called Dark Ages, as in Europe, as a matter of fact, but we're not dealing with Europe, we're dealing with India. This Dark Age is, in many ways, in terms of the formation of Hinduism, this consolidates Hinduism at the local level. Hinduism is consolidated. What I've been talking about, starting with the Aryans and continuing through the Iron Age with the Varnas, and so on. Now, during the Dark Age, where there's little contact at a general level, this is when Hinduism is fully established. And what we can say is that sort of society is at the local level. There are small kings, kinglets, and so on, but political centralization doesn't exist really. And it is the Brahmins who are in control. The Brahmins and their families and their temples. Insofar as there's any kind of political order, the Brahmins are the government officials. Little kings, little princes, the Brahmins are the government officials, such as they are, but they govern the communities at the local level. They govern the temples. They are the ones who control the religion, which is so important. And they dominate the other castes. And this really establishes them at this point as the local elites. Alongside and subordinate to them, I would say, is the military class, hereditary landlord military men. And these people are known as the Rajputs. Again, the key words, Rajputs, Rajputs, the Rajputs. And the Rajputs play a role right through, even under the British, into modern times. This military sort of landlord class, officials, it's hereditary in this group, in this subcaste, if you like, backbone of the Indian Army, etc., these people. Now, what's interesting, to complete the picture, there's no money, there's no towns, there's no little trade. So in the villages, and literally there are millions of villages in this country, it's huge, a barter economy develops, a barter economy. You have most of the people are peasants, but craftsmen develop alongside the peasants, shoemakers, furniture makers, iron sort of blacksmiths and people like that in the villages, and a trade develops, a barter. It's not money, shoes for grain, and so on. You have a barter economy in the villages. So the economic life is at the village level. It's simplified. There's no money. There's basically bartering that goes on between these groups. And they're isolated. The villages have no relationship. There are no towns and so on. It's a completely isolated, simple economy with low productivity, obviously. But so it's very important because this kind of village barter economy becomes basic. And even later, when towns and money and commercial life reappears under the Muslims, when they come in, they reestablish all of this. But this Hindu Brahmin barter economy, that's the base, and it explains the sort of very well. There is no growth in this economy. There's things remain the same, and we call this the Asiatic mode of production. We've already seen elements of it in the Ottoman Empire, but India is the Asiatic mode as a concept developed out of scholars looking at India. So we'll finish this and begin to talk about the early modern period next time.